I'm just delighted to be here. As you can see, my topic is Pearl Harbor. I'm going to be attacking the official story, and I'm going to be attacking the very commonly accepted revisionist story. I think this is a wonderful place. We're here in San Diego. I want to thank the San Diego group. I want to thank Jill and Mike in particular for the beautiful home where we're giving this. We're practically within sight of the Pacific Ocean. And of course, we were talking about the Pacific Ocean. We have this huge naval base just a few miles away, so I think this is absolutely admirable setting to talk about some of the basic facts of the Pacific War in World War II. And you'll notice that I'm trying to do it from an anti-fascist perspective. I'm always very uncomfortable when people ask me what I am, because I'm certainly not a liberal, that I would sooner die. But progressive is not a good name, and leftist, I don't know, and ultimately I think maybe anti-fascist is one of the better things you can be, at least at the present time, until we can figure out a better term. So I want to revisit the entire story, and from now on we're going to focus on the slides, and let's see if we have wonderful technology today.
Wow.
It's of course the attack on Pearl Harbor, so December 7th, 1941. It comes down to the sinking of about half a dozen semi-obsolete battleships, the killing of about 3,000 people, and the U.S. Enters World War II. Now, it's of course a favorite issue for people who want to argue, and this is the revisionist version, that somehow President Franklin D. Roosevelt is a party to a conspiracy, first of all, to make this happen, to somehow provoke Japan into war, the assumption being that Japan otherwise maybe would not have done these things. And then there's the question of foreknowledge, and the allegation is often made that Roosevelt knew in detail before the attack exactly when the attack was going to take place, and that he deliberately, systematically withheld all the intelligence from the admiral on the scene, Admiral Kimmel, who was the commander of the Pacific Fleet, and General Short, who commanded the Army District there. Now, I am going to argue that there is a conspiracy, there is a false flag operation, but that Roosevelt is not the mastermind of the conspiracy. Roosevelt is the target of the conspiracy. He is, in some ways, the victim. And that the prime mover of the conspiracy is none other than Winston S. Churchill, yes, the British imperialist, lifelong hater of the United States, as we will see, and the person who more than any other needed the United States to come into World War II as fast as possible in order to save the British Empire as he saw it. But you're also dealing with a phenomenon that is very well known in all the European languages. If you've ever heard words like in French, perfide Albion, in Italian, la perfida Albione, in German, das perfida Albion, you'll know that the British are famous for their treachery. And we have 300 years of documented track record of British treachery, going back to the fact that they are indeed the descendants of the Venetians, who are the world's all-time champions of treachery. If you know Iago, you know the mind of a Venetian. So my argument is going to be that there is a conspiracy. The kingpin of the conspiracy is Sir Winston Churchill. This is, of course, a direct attack on the neocons, who make Churchill into their god. I have a family grudge against him, as I'll show you a little bit later on. And that his cohorts in this are members of the invisible government of the United States, that is to say, the Morgan, Mellon, Rockefeller financier cabal, who are generally more loyal to the British Empire than they are to the American people, to be sure. Specifically, people like Colonel Stimson, who was the Secretary of War, an invisible, you might say, George Marshall, the general who was the head of the U.S. Army, Admiral Stark, Richmond K. Turner. I think probably the most important operative would be Richmond K. Turner at the nuts and bolts level. So it's a clique of Anglophile cabinet officials, naval officials, and army generals who allow all this to take place. The faction that's doing all this, of course, is the Edward VII faction. This is King Edward VII, Emperor of India. Remember, he's king of Britain and the empire for the first 10 years of the 20th century. He is probably the person who, more than any other, wrecked the 20th century. He is, generally speaking, the diplomatic brain behind World War I. Winston Churchill is his protege, in the sense that Winston Churchill's function during World War I and somewhat thereafter is to provide King Edward VII with parliamentary accounts. So you're going right to the heart of British imperialism. Far beyond the Rothschilds, far beyond the names that the average person here may know. This is an example of a moment where the king also happens to be the head of the oligarchy, it's not always the same person, and the main strategic mind of the British Empire at that time. And World War I and World War II are largely his handiwork, even though he died before they even started. This perhaps captures the essence of Winston Churchill, an international gangster. He had an American mother. I believe he hated her. They always say, oh, he liked the United States because of his American mother. Well, what if he hated his mother? Which I think is what we see here. So a gangster, hundreds of degrees beyond Al Capone. When I say invisible government, of course, I'm talking about this entity created under the aegis of J.P. Morgan. Morgan, Mellon, Rockefeller, we can add many, many other names. He, of course, is the agent of London in the United States. He's officially the agent of the British financier elite in Wall Street. During World War I, he is the guy who does all the military purchases for Britain and France. And he's the key guy to get the U.S. into World War I for basically no reason at all. So if I say Morgan, when I say Morgan, I mean the invisible government, the parallel government, the financier clique, the deep state, the cabal. There it is. And again, there's Edward VII, who gave his name to an entire period, right? The Edwardian period. And the Edwardian period was a deep eclipse of civilization, out of which came World War I and then World War II. Let's pause for a minute and think about the implications of the fact that there's a parallel government, invisible government. Again, many different terms, but I think you get the idea. Morgan, Mellon, Rockefeller in London. What does this mean for analyzing something like Pearl Harbor? Well, where is power located? If there's a president, do you assume that the president actually has power? Or is it possible that the power is located in the cabal of bankers? The typical behind and above the Oval Office. Above and behind, right? Dick Morris wrote behind the Oval Office. Let's think about above and behind the Oval Office. And generally, I would argue that with a couple of exceptions, main ones being Roosevelt and Kennedy, and you see what happens to Kennedy, the power resides in the bankers' cabal. And the president is a grinning stooge who's got to go out and run for office and glad hand people and live in the Holiday Inn and eat blintzes and kiss babies and all the rest of the stuff that a president has to do, which a real oligarch doesn't want to do, right? The stinking masses, they don't like that. Now, a couple of questions of method. You think Bush was the mastermind of 9/11? The argument falls by its own absurdity. Bush is a moron. How can he be the mastermind of anything? Isn't it clear? I've seen this bumper sticker, Bush knew. I thought, well, that's really not a very good bumper sticker. Bush doesn't know anything. What can he know? He knows that he has to follow orders. That's what he was told the day before 9/11. Something big is going to happen, Junior. Make sure you're on your toes tomorrow. We want you to follow orders really quick. Was Nixon the mastermind of Watergate? What do you think? Any opinions? I would say he's the victim of Watergate. What were you going to say?
I just said probably not. He
No.
Probably was not.
You look at the plumbers. Who's the plumbers? Howard Hunt of the CIA, James McCord of the CIA, Gordon Liddy of the FBI. The head of it is David Young, who works for Kissinger and Rockefeller. He's not the mastermind of it. He has criminal intent, it's clear, but he's somebody who's caught in a web that's not of his own making. And the whole point of this, I would say, is the general framework I would give to Watergate is it's a CIA operation to permanently weaken and destroy the presidency. Because remember, the purpose of oligarchy is oligarchy. And if you have a strong president, which is what the Constitution gives you, the oligarchs don't like that. How about this one? We have the deathbed confessions of Howard Hunt, that Johnson gave the order to kill JFK. What do you think of that one?
Awesome.
Yeah, he has no such power. He's a pathetic puppet in his own right. He's trembling. Is he going to get killed next? Right? He can't do that. He has no such ability. You can read all sorts of books by Doris Kearns Goodwin. She'll tell you what a pathetic little quivering lump of ego this guy was. And they always, the press at the time would always talk about his power Johnson's power, the Senate in his power. And of course, he was just a steward, right, running around. How about this one? Was Roosevelt the mastermind of Pearl Harbor?
Okay, no.
No. Because the fallacy of this kind of an argument, just in the most general terms, is it's always assumed by these characters who are writing in the anti-Roosevelt vein that everything that goes on in the government is ordered by Roosevelt. Well, wait a minute, you have to prove that. Because there's this thing called the invisible government. And we can show the invisible government is there before and after, and therefore during. So during this time, there's an invisible government, and it has its own agenda, which is not going to be the same as Roosevelt's. And with some of these appointees, you're going to see it very clearly. How about this one? This to show before. Was William McKinley the mastermind of the blowing up of the Maine? Right? The Spanish-American War, the founding of the empire, the Philippines, Cuba, all the rest of this stuff. And I would say again, no. The whole essence of it is, you've got to assume since the 1890s, if not earlier, but certainly since the mid-1890s, that there's a financier cabal whose power in finance and foreign policy is generally greater than that of the elected, visible president. Well, here we'll do the Maine for you, okay? Maine blows up in Havana Harbor, 1898. McKinley is the president. Now, he is a president who is not enthusiastic about imperialism. This is a good example of a conservative Republican, an actual conservative. He's interested in having a high tariff, which I think at this point is exactly what you need. And he doesn't like imperialism. He doesn't really want the Philippines. He thinks that this poses more problems than it solves. The British, of course, demand that the U.S. take the Philippines. You know why they did that? To keep Germany from taking them. Because it was clear the Spanish were collapsing. If the Germans had gotten the Philippines, the Germans might have had a way to win World War I. So the whole goal of it was that the U.S. had to take it to keep the Germans out. Now here's the famous sketch of the blowing up of the Maine, right? And we have Los Bin Ladenitos. los muy malos Bin Ladenitos españoles. And they have a mine, of course, and they're going to blow it up. And it says up here, this picture fixes the responsibility to the satisfaction of the American people. Too bad it's a fraud. Too bad the American people were dumb. They got it wrong that time. Now, look, this is an example. This is Hearst, right? Hearst is the yellow press. He wants war. He wants the empire. Both houses of Congress warning McKinley that they want the war and they want to take the Philippines and the rest of this stuff. So this is now the leading yellow journalist, right? This is the Journal American later on, if you know the New York Press. And they're telling McKinley, you got to do it, right? And this stuff here says that the Bond Syndicate doesn't want the war, and the Pope, that McKinley is working with the Pope. Oh my God, poor McKinley. And what ultimately, you see that he's not the imperialist that they wanted. So what do they do with him? They kill him. Here he is getting shot by Leon Czolgosz, 1901 in Buffalo. Right? There's McKinley getting killed. Here's the killer. He's a mentally disturbed anarchist. He's a patsy. He's a recluse. And who runs him? Always the interesting question. Emma Goldman, British agent. She was active as a British agent in Poland against the Russians, and then brought over here. She created this settlement house in Chicago, and she was the one who gave Czolgosz the brainwashing light rinse to get him to go and do what it was that they wanted him to do. Okay, so this is typical. So here we have, way before Roosevelt, an example of a president being assassinated because he was crossing the invisible government. He wasn't the imperialist that they wanted. Who did they want? They wanted a real racist, a liberal Republican, pro-imperialist. He hates Mexicans, he hates Chinese, he hates Russians at different times. And he's a puppet of Morgan. There is absolutely no doubt. The British ambassador writes a letter about him saying, you've got to remember that the president has a mental age of 6. He's the founder of the tradition that you see with Bush. In other words, the liberal Republicans, the bull moose liberal Wall Street Republicans. Go back to him. If people want to defend him, we can go to that in the debate. Here's another example. In the 1920s, spelled wrong here, sorry. We have Andrew Mellon. He's the Secretary of the Treasury. It was said that Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover served under Andrew Mellon. That was proverbial at the time. So The representative of the Wall Street group is more powerful than this trio of Republican one-termers during the 1920s. John D. Rockefeller, this is Jr., right? So these are the sorts of people that you can associate with this invisible government group. During the 1930s and 40s, this is the Morgan. This is J. Pierpont Morgan, the son of the guy that we showed you a couple of minutes ago. And of course, the Skull and Bones magazine of Henry Luce, right? Founded by Henry Luce of Skull and Bones, puts him on the cover, gives him publicity. And you've already got Allen Dulles, the guy who's later going to be the head of the CIA, is already at work in Wall Street during World War I, for example. He spends World War I in Switzerland, just like he does in World War II. Okay, so there's an invisible government. We've seen some of them. Now, the other problem you have is, in our day-to-day work, we have to essentially assume that the US and the British under neocon rule, under Bush-Blair, are, very crudely put, the main danger to the world. There's no way around this. They are the main danger to the world. But if we go back 60 or 70 years, this is not so. You can't just take the present situation and project it back as far as you want. In those days, you had Hitler, Mussolini, Tojo, Stalin, and this British group, right? The Lord Astor, Lady Astor, the so-called Clifton or Cliveden set. So we have to remember that we should not project the current degraded situation back onto the New Deal state of the 1930s and 1940s, because at that point the US is not the main force for evil in the world. I would say, having lived through it, the transition is basically the Kennedy assassination and the Vietnam War. That's when the US starts to be what we have to say it is. Now, a couple of other things to bear in mind. The British, notably, have world naval supremacy. From the Battle of Trafalgar, right, Admiral Nelson defeats the combined French and Spanish fleets in the Mediterranean, up until 1942 to 1943. And believe me, they did everything they could not to lose world naval supremacy. Sorry about that. Some of my slides are not quite perfect, but I'm doing the best I can. So think of World War II as one of the phenomena that accompany the British losing their worldwide naval supremacy, which they had maintained, as you see here, for about a century and a half. This is a really big deal, because the naval supremacy, of course, is how the world holds together, right? Maritime sea lanes, I mean, that's what there was at the time. Now, let's do a short course in geopolitics. British geopolitics says, if there's a series of different competing powers, the British have to ally. If the British are number one, they have to ally with number three against number two. Okay? So if the British are number one, they've got to ally with the US against Germany, which they do. And actually, in World War I, you have to remember, they even ally with Japan. Japan is on the side of the British in World War I. People know this? No, it's absolutely fundamental. That Japan works with the British during World War I against Germany. One of the problems of having the alliance between Tojo and Hitler in World War II was a lot of German resentment against the fact that the Japanese had stabbed them in the back. They took all their colonies in the Pacific when the Germans were tied up in Europe. So again, here the British do the masterpiece. They ally with number three and number four against number two, and they wipe out number two. But now what happens? Now it's later, it's after World War I. The German fleet has been completely destroyed. It's gone. It's at the bottom of the ocean. It's Capel Float. Complicated story. So now you ally with number three against number two. What does it mean?
Pearl Harbor.
Yes, in effect. They ally with Japan against the US. And in the 1920s, this is the main thing that's going on. Has anybody ever looked into the history of the 1920s? It's not taught, and maybe from this you'll see a little bit why. The other problem is, you want to become an ally of the British? Man, you better watch out. It's better to be their enemy. They do more damage to you as an ally than as a friend. Let's look at all the countries that went to work for the British in World War I. Russia, the military forces are almost completely destroyed. There's a revolution fomented by the British through Lenin and these other people. France, 3 million dead. They still haven't recovered demographically. Italy, semi-destroyed, staggered, almost driven out of the war, fascist regime after that. Serbia, completely flattened, overrun. Romania, completely flattened. Belgium, flattened except for a very small bit of coast. So if you become an ally of the British, they push you into the front, and you take the really heavy losses. Right? The British have far fewer losses than the Russians or the French in these wars, because they want to use you up. Because they're also planning later on, as we've seen, they know that, today's number 3 is tomorrow's number 2. So make sure you weaken them as much as you can. And that's their approach to World War II. That's the betrayal of the United States in all of this stuff. Now, in 1916, the U.S. is not yet in World War I. They passed this Navy bill, and it basically says there are going to be 10 new U.S. battleships and 6 battle cruisers. And it means that the U.S. will surpass the British Royal Navy. And Churchill is up in arms. And you have to remember that this is a little bit later. I guess I've got to fix my slide. This is just to indicate the tremendous pro-fascist sympathies of Churchill. He says Mussolini rendered a service to the entire world. We'll get to this in just a minute. Here it is again. The 1916 Naval Law. 156 new warships, 16 capital ships, and if they built them, the U.S. takes world naval supremacy. Now this the British will not accept. They will not allow this to happen. The U.S. political consensus, it doesn't say we want the biggest navy in the world, but it says a navy second to none, which means the same thing. It's a little bit more diplomatic. Now, if you read the various books on Pearl Harbor, one of the things that you will not find is the fact that there are 2 factions in the U.S. Navy. There's a pro-British faction and an anti-British faction, just as there are 2 political factions. At least sometimes there were 2. But in the Navy, we definitely have them. This is the anti-British head of the U.S. Navy. He's Admiral William Benson, Chief of Naval Operations during World War I. He says at various times, I don't know why I'm fighting Germany. I'd just as soon be fighting the British. He's a Roman Catholic, and he does not buy the Anglo-Saxon race patriot stuff. He's oriented towards the Vatican. The Vatican tried under Pope Benedict XV to put an end to World War I. This is an indication of a continuing anti-British faction in the armed forces. Now here is Benson talking to the British at Versailles, Versailles being the peace conference at the end of World War I. He says, if you persist in demanding naval supremacy, says Benson to the British, I can assure you that it will mean one thing, and that is war between Great Britain and the United States. That's the essential feature of the 1920s, and I'm sure you've never heard an inkling of it, and I'm afraid that Mr. Stinnett, in his book on Pearl Harbor, has not done anything to enlighten you about what's going on. Now, here's the British faction in the Navy. This is Admiral Sims. He's the Anglophile. He has these battleships. He takes them over to Britain. He becomes the American battle squadron of the British battle fleet, and he's very happy to do it because he's an Anglophile. He hates Germany. He loves the British. And look who loves him. Not one Sims, but 3 Sims on the cover of the Skull and Bones weekly magazine, right? He's a baseball player. He's a naval officer. He's a country gentleman. William S. Sims. What a great guy, huh? So they build up, maybe they wanted to run him for president. I don't know what the story was, but this year it could have been governor, senator, different things. That's the British faction. So this is Time magazine, in these years in particular, is the voice of the invisible government. Now, in the army, same thing. Pro-British, Pershing, Wall Street's favorite general. Anti-British, MacArthur. And this is really important because this happens to be the greatest general on any side in World War II. Tremendous asset to have. But he's anti-British. There's a wonderful quote from him when somebody says, well, what do you think of the State Department? And he says, yeah, there are 2 factions in there, communists and British imperialists. And he doesn't like either one. So you'll see how he acts to counter the British. How about General Billy Mitchell, the air power theorist, right? With these old bombers, he's able to sink battleships. Anti-British. You know why? Because the British have these 30 huge battleships. And he's coming along and saying, guys, your battleships are worthless. They're all obsolete. The British say, oh no, we're going to dominate the world with our battleships. He says, forget it. And he sinks a few just to show. Now, the prelude to Pearl Harbor, and we will get to Pearl Harbor soon, the prelude is the U.S.-British naval rivalry of the 1920s, which none of these writers ever tell you about, but there are plenty of scholarly books that talk about the era of U.S.-British tension. Now remember, the battleship fleet is a strategic weapon, right? The intercontinental ballistic missile of today is the battle fleet, right? And the British could line up almost 30 of these things, right? At tremendous cost. Air power exists, right? There are planes and zeppelins flying around. But they're thought of not as something independent, but they're the spotters, right? They're an auxiliary for the battleships so they can shoot over the horizon and get the right targets and all that. Now, the Japanese have joined the British in World War I, and they get a reward. All of these islands that you read about, all of these naval battles where the Marines have to land and fight the Japanese and get killed in large numbers, are generally the results of the Versailles Conference. Now, these are all groups that were under German control, and at Versailles they officially go to Japan as League of Nations mandates, colonies, in effect. Now, we're going to see that with the Marianas, the Carolines, the Gilberts, and a couple of others, all the U.S. supply lines in the Pacific have been blocked by the Japanese. We'll show you the map in just a second. In other words, what the British do is they set up a conflict between Japan and the United States by giving Japan these key islands. So it's a time bomb for a new conflict. Let's do some looking at this. See what they get? The Marshall Islands, right? If you read the Pearl Harbor story, the admirals, Kimmel thinks there's going to be an attack coming at him from the Marshall Islands. Then we have the Marianas out here. The Japanese are out here. And the Gilberts, we'll see the Gilberts in a minute. But if you notice, look, the U.S. supply line comes from San Diego to Hawaii, and then it has to go to the Philippines. But look, the Marshalls are right there blocking the way. Then the supply line, as you'll see later in World War II, the supply line to Australia goes down here, and that is also blocked by these islands that the Japanese get. Let's see if we can throw some more light on this. Here we go. The Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Carolines, and the Marianas. So the Japanese basically get a whole bunch of islands that's right on the supply line to Pearl Harbor and then to the Philippines. See? It's basically a pre-programmed clash set up by the British at Versailles. And the same story here. If you want to go to Australia, they're going to get you from here if you don't watch out. And that's, Guadalcanal and all that. Right? It's a big, really big deal because of that. So the Japanese are allowed to expand under British auspices with the idea there's going to be a collision between the U.S. and the Japanese. So that the British can then dominate that and emerge as more powerful. See? Divide and conquer. Perfide Albion. This is just gives you some idea of some of these island chains. I think those are the Gilberts, maybe? Okay. Now, at Versailles, right, we're now at the end of World War I, the peace conference. We have Woodrow Wilson and his controller, Colonel House, from the Invisible Government. His enemies used to call him Colonel Whorehouse. And he is really a controller, because he's much closer to the British than Woodrow Wilson is. So here's Versailles, right? You've got Woodrow Wilson, you've got Clemenceau of France, you've got Lloyd George for the British, and Orlando for Italy. These are the big four at the Versailles Conference. Right? The Italian and French navies are not really a factor. And here's another view of Versailles. There's Lloyd George, I believe. And you have these people from all over the world. So they're going to dictate the terms to Germany. Now, to document Churchill's hatred of the United States and his determination to keep world naval supremacy, this is a speech to the House of Commons, November 1918. The First World War has just ended. And what's he thinking about? He's thinking about a new conflict. Nothing in the world, nothing that you may think of or dream of, or anyone may tell you, no arguments however specious, no appeals however seductive, must lead you to abandon that naval supremacy on which the life of your country depends. Now, against whom are these remarks directed? There's only one in the world. It's the U.S. This is a declaration of potential war against the U.S. by our dear friend, the gangster Churchill. In 1919, after centuries when there had been numerous navies competing in the North Atlantic, we now get a situation where there are 2 battle fleets left because the German battleships were scuttled by their own crews up in Scotland. So Washington was gripped by the uneasy awareness that there were now only 2 battle fleets left in the North Atlantic. So you're going head-to-head against the British. Here are some interesting quotes from an official of the British Foreign Office, right, the British equivalent of the State Department. He says, if there's a war between the US and Japan, we cannot remain neutral. Oh, well, I guess that means you'll be joining us based on Anglo-Saxon race patriotism and solidarity, right? No. They would incline towards a pro-Japanese intervention, in spite of the fact that their natural sympathies would be on the American side. Too bad. In our own material interest, we would have to take action, including armed action, to prevent the United States from reducing Japan to complete bankruptcy. This is a paper, British Neutrality in the Event of a Japanese-American War, October 1921. And this is really only the tip of the iceberg. How about this one? David Lloyd George, British Prime Minister, talking to Colonel House. Sorry, Colonel House got left off. Great Britain would spend her last guinea, her last pound, to keep a navy superior to that of the United States or any other power. This is the dominant issue of the 1920s. Colonel House says, relations between the US and the British are beginning to look like the very hostile relation of England and Germany, writes Colonel House from Versailles. Conflict is growing. The Navy says to Wilson, look here, Wilson, every rival of the British has eventually been at war with Britain, and they've all been defeated. And we are becoming the greatest rival they've ever had. What's the conclusion? You're going to be at war with Britain before too long. So even Wilson can see this. We are now on the eve of a commercial war of the most severe sort, and I think that Britain will prove as capable of commercial savagery as Germany has been. Now this is coming from an Anglophile who works for the invisible government, and nevertheless, he's basically saying there's a dynamic in this situation that we can hardly really control. Now the planning, I won't go through these plans, but I essentially was the first person, I think, to write about War Plan Red. Have you heard about this one? War Plan Red and War Plan Red-Orange. The U.S. War Plan, the main one, was War Plan Red. What do you do if there's a war against the British? The main thing you do is attack Canada. And you're probably going to be dealing with War Plan Red-Orange, where the British would bring Japanese and Indian troops from India into Vancouver, British Columbia, to wage war on the North American continent. Now, this was absolutely real. This was the main thing that they drilled, and everybody has forgotten it. Now, without going into too much detail, there were 2 crises in the 1920s. The U.S. and Britain come close to war in 1920 to 21 over the question of battleships. And then there's another period, 1927 to 1930, about cruisers. I take it that this is all quite new to people, but it's quite well documented. Now, the answer to the first war crisis, right, the arc. And here's the Washington Naval Conference. At least this is Charles Evans Hughes here in the middle, with largely Japanese, but also some others. Very hard. On the whole internet, there's almost no picture of the Washington Naval Conference. And the whole thing is forgotten. Now, here's what they do. They essentially say, look, we don't want to have an arms race at sea. Let's not have that. Why don't we all agree to disarmament? And let's have the battleships be in the following ratio. This is capital ships, battleships and battle cruisers, the really big ones. The British get a ratio of 5. The US gets equality with 5. The Japanese get 3, and the French and the Italians get 1 2/3 each. 5 to 5 to 3 to 1.67 to 1.67. Every schoolboy used to know that. No more? My roommate in college recited to me that. He had been at the Hotchkiss School, I guess even there. So this is an attempt at disarmament, but it's going to backfire. As a matter of fact, this is the door to war. Now, according to the treaty, it's what we just said, 5 to 5 to 3 to 1.7 to 1.7. The problem is that the U.S. underbuilt because of these Republican administrations that didn't want to spend money, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover. And the Japanese, of course, overbuilt. So if the U.S. underbuilds and the Japanese overbuilds, that's the recipe for Pearl Harbor, because it makes Pearl Harbor a good try. In other words, it becomes a realistic gamble for the Japanese. Now, the treaty ratio is this. It's been estimated that by the time we get to the by the time we get to about 1930 to 35, the British are 5, the U.S. is 3.78, Japan 3.1, France 1.89, Italy 1.5. This is actually what they have. This is what they should have or allowed to have. They can have this or less, I suppose, and here's what they have. See? The U.S. has underbuilt, and the Japanese have slightly overbuilt. And the fact that this is so close, and also that the U.S. is inevitably split, because you have the Atlantic and the Pacific, and then you even have the Gulf of Mexico. You're actually split 3 ways. This makes it realistic for the Japanese to think, how about a surprise attack? We'll wipe out the Navy, and we can win the war. Thanks to the oligarch, Anglophile, invisible government operative Charles Evans Hughes. Now, the U.S. Navy General Board, and the organism of the day, protests to Hughes, saying, don't do this. The United States was about to build 15 battleships. This is what brought Japan to the conference. If you agree to scrap them, the Japanese will go home and pursue their aggressive program. So if you take the 15 battleships off the Navy list, our task may not be hopeless, but the temptation to Japan to take a chance becomes very great. The chance is the Pearl Harbor sneak attack. Because, of course, the Japanese were known to do sneak attacks. They had done a sneak attack on Russia with Admiral Togo in 1905, right at Port Arthur. Right? They sank the Russian, they destroyed the whole Russian Pacific Fleet with a surprise attack before a declaration of war. Now, this is a sort of a journalistic comment. This is a guy writing about the same thing. He says, this Washington Naval Conference was a real blunder. The United States was cast as the première stripteaseuse. Take off her clothes in the presence of her enemies. And that's exactly what it is, because the one difference is, and I should have stressed this before, that the U.S. actually has 15 keels that are being built. The other ones have hypothetical battleships that they're not going to build. So who actually scrapped modern ships that were being built? Only the U.S. So it's a completely one-sided sacrifice by the U.S. under the influence of these invisible government guys. And you can see here the president at the time, Harding, says, well, we should have naval maritime leadership, and we should have a navy equal to the aspirations of the country. Harding is, of course, corrupt, right? Everybody knows about Teapot Dome and this bawdy house that he has going in Washington. But what happens to him? This is a possible assassination. He goes to Vancouver, British Columbia, August 1923, and comes back poisoned, they say, from shellfish, and he dies. When I went to Vancouver, British Columbia, I had this in mind next week. I wasn't able to show this in Vancouver, but this could be an assassination. We really don't know. Now, how about General Billy Mitchell? Here the issue is now another one. In the U.S. military forces, there are some people who say the battleship will always be supreme, and other people say no, air power. Now, what happens is Billy Mitchell says to the Navy, all right, we'll do a test. I'll bring my Army bombers, and we'll see your battleships. And they say, all right, look, we have the German battleship Ostfriesland, one of the most powerful battleships in the world, known as the unsinkable Ostfriesland. So they say, we're going to anchor this in Chesapeake Bay, or whatever it is, or off Chesapeake Bay, and you come with your bombers and see if you can sink it, because we're sure you'll never do any damage. So, of course, he comes with the bombers, and he sinks the thing in 5 minutes. And the Navy then goes nuts, and they court-martial him, right? Remember the movie, right? The court-martial of General Billy Mitchell? It's all new, huh? There was a pretty well-known movie, The Court-Martial of General Billy Mitchell. He was played by James Stewart in that film, as I recall. Okay? Now, let's look at the U.S. ruling class, okay, from which these various officers are derived. And here we have isolationists and America Firsters. Their goal is the hatred of Roosevelt. The hatred of Roosevelt, I think, is generally a marker for very bad political phenomena. Let's see why. This is a wonderful cartoon from the New Yorker. 1936 was Roosevelt's most radical campaign. Let me just go back to Roosevelt for a second. 1936, he said, "Those economic royalists hate me, and I welcome their hatred," in Madison Square Garden, and it just became pandemonium. It's probably the most radical political campaign of the 20th century, more so than most others, because he's basically saying, you're the forgotten man, the Wall Street oligarchs hate me, and you know who they are, and I welcome their hatred. Imagine that? The Wall Street, imagine Bush saying, Wall Street hates me and I welcome their hatred. It was just another world. Okay, so here's the other world. Here we are on Fifth Avenue, I suppose, or Park Avenue. We're going to the Translux to hiss Roosevelt. Now, if you're not an old New Yorker, these were newsreel theaters. There were theaters in downtown Manhattan that had only newsreels all day long. So you go in there, you didn't have TV, so you I want to see what Hitler looks like. I want to see Stalin's mustache. Fine. You go there and they play one newsreel from different companies, right? You could basically sit there for 3 hours and see all different newsreels. So here's a bunch of rather dubious oligarchs, right? They're pretty fruity and degenerate, as you see. And they've finished dinner, so they're going to, let's go down to the movie theater and hiss Roosevelt. So this renders the idea of an extremely rich parasitical elite who hate. Ordinary document. This you can read in Stinnett, right? We'll show you who Stinnett is in a minute. Admiral Richardson is in the White House. So they're sitting in the Oval Office, and the head of the Pacific Fleet, at that point here in San Diego, says, "Mr. President, senior officers of the Navy do not have the trust and confidence in the civilian leadership of this country that is essential for the successful prosecution of a war in the Pacific." October 8th, 1940. Now, can you imagine the gall of an admiral or a general sitting there with the elected president saying, "We don't trust you"? Basically, you're a commie, because that's what they're saying. They're saying, we think Harry Hopkins is a commie, and we think you're a commie too, and we don't have any confidence in you. So don't start any wars, because we don't trust you. Now, if I ever found myself in this position, I would say, that's good, Admiral, you're fired, and get out of here right now, and you're fired. Right? You're fired with prejudice. So he was ousted. Roosevelt finessed it. He didn't do the obvious. He kept his temper. He didn't fire him immediately. But later on, and this is the guy who's then replaced by Kimmel, the Pearl Harbor admiral. The Navy brass is drawn from the social class that hates Roosevelt. You can see a very interesting little book called They Hate Roosevelt. It's a pamphlet, 1936, by the journalist Marcus Childs. The Roosevelt haters are almost 100% pro-Mussolini, pro-fascist. And about a third of them, or maybe a half of them, are also pro-Hitler. Some examples. This is that campaign that I was telling you about, right? 1936, Madison Square Garden speech. They hate me, and I welcome their hatred. All right. The U.S. ruling class, and the British ruling class too, are pro-Mussolini starting 1922. They're pro-Hitler. They think they can play Hitler against Stalin and the Soviets. And the key pro-Nazis would include Prescott Bush, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, Joseph P. Kennedy. The father of John F. Kennedy is pro-Nazi. In the British side, we've got Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, Lady Astor, the Clifton set, Astor Brown, Lothian Halifax, Sir Neville Chamberlain, the Duke of Hamilton, the guy that Rudolf Hess was flying to see when Rudolf Hess jumped off in England in spring of 1941. So there's a whole bunch of fascists. Now here's what they do. Here's Roosevelt, president-elect, February 15th, 1933. In Miami, here's Roosevelt. Here's the mayor of Chicago, Chernak. He's a very important guy in the Democratic Party. He's the boss of the whole big Chicago machine. So there's an assassination attempt. The bullets miss Roosevelt and kill Chernak. So there's an attempt to kill Roosevelt even before he gets into office. People have pointed out this is essentially 40 years before the Kennedy assassination, and it prefigures the Kennedy assassination. It simply says, anyone who tries to exercise the constitutional capabilities of the presidency will be slaughtered by the invisible government, be it 1933 or, 30 years later, 1963. This is Chernak. He was killed. He got into the line of fire and was killed, and he's, again, a very important person in his own right. Now, this is also the Smedley Butler story. Do people know this one?
Yes.
Here's General Smedley Butler. He's a war hero from World War I, and he is approached by Morgan financiers, and they say, look, we want to have a coup. We want to have, well, this is the 1933. We want to have a version of the March on Rome. This is Mussolini's March on Rome, October 1922, right? It's really a piece of political theater, but you need to have something of a mass movement in order to do it. In other words, you've got to have all these fascists who are willing to get out there and run around in the countryside. And it allows the king to say, all right, I'm under duress. Mussolini should be the next prime minister. So what the Morgan people want to do is to have a march on Washington in precisely this form and have a coup. And here it is. Here's Mussolini with he has 4 people. Actually, this is Balbo. I knew his son. His son was the black and white Scotch salesman from northern Italy in the 1960s. So here they are entering Rome, and there he is, see? And they basically say, let's have a Mussolini for the United States. Because up until the end of the 1930s, Mussolini is adored by the U.S. ruling class. I mean, he's everything that they love. They're 100% in favor of him. Look, Life magazine, Skull and Bones, right? Once again. The New York Times, you can find articles in the New York Times. They love Mussolini. Okay, now the Roosevelt haters are organized. We have the American Liberty League. This is a group of those extremely wealthy economic royalists who are trying to mount operations against Roosevelt. And who do we have? We have Raskob of Wall Street, Irene DuPont, Al Smith, the first Catholic candidate, but a real reactionary. Dean Acheson, who's later going to be a controller of Truman on the part of the Harriman Group. We've got the Morgan plot. And we've got, this essentially is the ancestor of the Liberty Lobby and today's American Free Press. And I have to say, I think their influence is largely deplorable. They veer very far towards, I guess, anti-Semitism is the only way to describe what they do. Here's Irene DuPont. He's, of course, the heir to the main line of the fortune. And he is simply a Nazi. He's a member of the U.S. ruling class. He's a Nazi. And this, what they mean by America First? Well, it essentially means don't intervene to stop Hitler or anybody else. Who pays for this? Regnery. You know who this is? It's the leading neocon publishing house today. Regnery, Chicago. Smith Richardson, Vicks Vapor Rub. Robert Wood of Sears Roebuck. Patterson of the New York Daily News, which was reactionary. And McCormick was the Chicago Tribune. Okay? So they're all basically saying, don't do anything to interfere with Hitler and Mussolini. Let them fight Stalin. How about Lindbergh? Okay, the great air hero, New York to Paris in a monoplane. Goering, the head of the German Luftwaffe. So he's given him this special sword. I apologize for the quality of the picture. Here we can do better. Here's Lindbergh with Goering again, and here's Lindbergh with Rudolf Hess, Hitler's right-hand man. Okay? So he's cavorting with Nazis, and remember, Lindbergh's wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, I think that's her there, is the daughter of a Morgan partner. And here's, again, Skull and Bones magazine. Here's Dwight Morrow, partner in Morgan. He was an aide to General Pershing. We've seen him. The bad British faction in the army. He's Lindbergh's father-in-law, and he leads the attack on General Billy Mitchell. So you get an idea of the faction fight in the 1920s between the Patriots and the Anglophiles. Now, you know the famous children's cartoonist Dr. Seuss, right?
Yes.
Okay. He does this thing. Here's Lindbergh, and here's Hitler. And the Hitler is sort of, you look at him, he's this swastika, and I'm not exactly sure what this says, but over here he says, "'Tis Roosevelt, not Hitler, that the world should really fear." This sums up the mentality of the Roosevelt haters, I think, to a T. And this is where he gets his start. Can you have another one? This is better. "It's smart to shop at Adolph's. All victories guaranteed," says Lindbergh. So the idea is that he has given himself over to pro-Nazi propaganda. This is an interesting one. Right after Pearl Harbor, there's a meeting of the Americans for Peace Society with Sibley Webster, no relation of mine. So we got Lindbergh, and they call themselves Americans for Peace. They changed the name of America First to Americans for Peace. And one of the writers, one of the participants reports, well, some of these guys have to keep quiet, but we should keep the organization. We should keep going quietly. We must get ready for the next attack, which must be made upon this communistic administration. There you have it, right? That Roosevelt is a crypto-communist and a communist, and I'm sure a crypto-Jew and all the rest of it. Now, if we look at the people that try to accuse Roosevelt for Pearl Harbor, we have to make Japan look good, right? We have to make Japan look like they're peaceful. If we look at the book by Stinnett, he says, Japan sincerely wanted peace. That's one of his theses, right? In other words, they had to be goaded. They had to be provoked. Well, I'm afraid this cannot be maintained in the light of simple facts, right? That Japan is certainly a fascist aggressor as much as Nazi Germany, and perhaps more than Nazi Germany. They have a longer track record. They begin attacking Manchuria, right, the very vital industrialized area of northern China. They then invade China in 1937. We have the rape of Nanjing. We'll talk about this in a minute. And there were at that time, among real conservatives, people who were very sympathetic to Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists. And I don't know whether this rings a bell at all. In my lifetime, I have had the honor of meeting his son, General Wei Go-chan, who told me interesting stories about his father and about their contacts with Emperor Hirohito. As soon as France falls to Hitler, the Japanese take French Indochina. And it's clear that they're then going to take the Netherlands' possessions. That would be what we know as Indonesia today. And the British possessions. That would be Australia and New Zealand. And you can see this is getting to be quite significant. In Japan, there are two factions. A Strike North school that says attack Russia, and a Strike South school that says your real enemy is the British, the French, and the Dutch, and you've got to get rid of the U.S. to prevent them from interfering. So here's what the Japanese end up with. They start with Japan. In 1895, they take Korea and Formosa. They then, in 1931, take Manchuria. They take the entire coast of China. They take Indochina. And next will be, I think, if not Malaya, right? Singapore. This is all British. Malaysia today. Australia over here, or well, not it's further down, but ultimately the Philippines, right? And at this point, the Philippines is a U.S. possession. So this is a fascist aggressor. Everybody convinced? I don't see how you can do it any other way. Here's the zones controlled by the Japanese in Korea. It's Manchuria, Taiwan, all the main ports, Hong Kong, Canton, all the rest of this. Now, one thing that does happen is, at a certain point, the Japanese get over here and they run against the Soviets in Mongolia. And this is a big battle won by Marshal Zhukov. Anybody know this one? It's the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol, and the Soviets decisively defeat the Japanese. And this essentially means that the Strike North School is not going to fare very well, because basically the Japanese say the Soviets are just much too tough. Don't do that. Try the other ones. Try the Anglo-Americans. They're probably going to be softer. They also take most of Indochina, right? The former French colonies, Vietnam. Right? The prelude to the Vietnam War is the Japanese taking it. And Ho Chi Minh gets going against the Japanese. And then they're going to take Malaya against the British. Now let's just pause for the rape of Nanjing. It's probably the greatest atrocity in World War II. Because it amounts to killing 500,000 people in a period of 3 or 4 months. So I think it goes to March of 1938. So total killings by the Japanese in China is estimated between 3 million to 10 million. 6 million is the middle figure, right? This matches whatever goes on in the Holocaust in Europe. And they're killing Chinese, Indonesians, Koreans, Filipinos, Indo-Chinese, and Western prisoners of war. It's sometimes known as the other Holocaust or the forgotten Holocaust. Now, the revisionist position of Mr. Stinnett, whose book I'm going to show you in a minute, basically says, well, that's not your affair. Keep telling the Japanese, oh yes, here's your oil, here's your scrap metal, here's everything else you need. We're not going to protest this. That's not our affair. And you see, it's this entire area, and the collision with the Soviets is along this area up here. It turns them south. So the Soviet view they realized that Zhukov has defeated the Japanese at Khalkhin Wall in Mongolia, and it essentially means that the outcome of all this is April 1941, a Japanese-Soviet neutrality pact. But it could have gone the other way. You have to think for a minute, what if the Japanese had decided to attack the Soviets? This would have been very bad for the world, because then the Soviets would have gone under. The Japanese and the Germans would have met along the Trans-Siberian Railway, and you'd have a nightmare of Eurasia under fascist control, Nazi fascist Japanese control. So I think you have to think about, when you think about Roosevelt, you have to think, you want to do something to prevent the Japanese from doing that. You have to create a little bit of a diversion to the Japanese to say, hey, wait a minute, we're still here, and we're quite formidable too, so watch out for us, and don't you dare concentrate everything against the Soviets. Now, the Axis, the original Axis is the tripartite pact of September 1940, the Rome, Berlin, Tokyo Axis. And it says that if any of these gets into a war with a third power, the other two have to join. So who's it directed against? And this book is quite simply the main target that I have in this talk. And here he is. He's Robert B. Stinnett. He works for something called the Independent Foundation, not far from here, I'm pretty sure. He has worked at various newspapers in California. He is, I think it's fair to say, an anti-New Deal ideologue. Of course, that doesn't prove anything about Pearl Harbor. Now, he's got this paper. Have people read his book, by the way? Anyone? Well, don't. I mean, you won't need to after we're finished here, right? Just hang on for a few more minutes and you'll save yourself all that reading. He's got a paper by a guy called McCollum, who's a top Navy officer. And McCollum says, let's do 8 different things. Let's make a deal with the British to use bases in the Pacific, especially Singapore. Let's make a deal with the Dutch. Let's help Chiang Kai-shek. Let's send some cruisers to the Philippines. Let's send some submarines to the Philippines. Let's move the fleet from San Diego to Hawaii. Let's make sure that the Dutch don't get too cozy with the Japanese. Let's have a trade embargo with Japan. And then at the end, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better. At all events, we must be carefully prepared to accept the threat of war. Now for Stinnett, again our dear friend, he regards this paper, which he's discovered, and that's his merit, right? He found this in the archives. He thinks this proves that FDR provoked war with Japan. Well, I'm trying to show you up to now that the whole framework of the thing makes these measures relatively obvious measures of not lending your hand to the Japanese genocide. Because what if you get, Japan is going to control Manchuria, China, Korea, Vietnam, Malaya, Indonesia, Australia, and New Zealand. I mean, that becomes threatening. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, that's an awful lot. That's a lot of the world. I mean, you're just going to let that happen? And again, the U.S. at this point is not the main evil force in the world. And of course, he wants to batten on this. If they could be led to commit an overt act, so much the better. Problem is, did Roosevelt write that? No. Did he see it? Can't prove it. All these things pretty much were done, but a lot of them are just, I would say, these are obvious things. I think you can argue the merits of these things. If you didn't do these things, you could be accused of being an appeaser, a pro-fascist. So, there are 8 provocations only if you think the appeasement of Japan is normal. Stinnett finds himself actually favoring the British line, and the British line indeed is appeasement of Japan, or support from Japan. And I must say that there's very little anti-fascist sentiment in Stinnett's work. In other words, he's not interested in the rape of Nanjing or the inexorable march of Japanese aggression through the area. Now, the one thing that he does dig up is this Bungo Strait. I'm sorry, I got the slide a little bit wrong, but see the arrow? This is the so-called Japanese Inland Sea. Everybody on that? He claims that Roosevelt sends a couple of warships into this area in the fall of 1941. Now, you know, it's not a tea party. It's obviously a dangerous thing to do. Well, I guess you can evaluate that the way you want to. I'm trying to show you a little bit of the evidence that speaks perhaps against what I'm saying, so you can maybe evaluate the entire thing. Because I don't think Stinnett really does that. Remember, and I think I say this. Let's see if I can say this right here. No, I You never want to let an oligarch attack you according to his schedule. You always want to somehow knock him off balance with something. And I'll show you how this works. So, how did the British appease Japan? Well, in July of 1940, after the French had gone under, the British agreed to close the Burma Road. The Burma Road is the only way that supplies can get into China. And the Chinese are fighting a big, big war with Japan in the middle of China. So the British agreed to cut off the Chinese for 3 months as a concession to Japan. Remember, the British hate Chiang Kai-shek and the British support Mao. This is another story that leads us to other terrible events coming up later on. So, why move the fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor? Who would ever want to leave San Diego? I don't want to leave. I'm here and I would stay here forever. But the goal is obviously to deter Japan, to provide some measure to say, wait a minute, we do exist, and you're not allowed to take everything of the French, the British, and the Dutch in the Pacific. It's a somewhat feeble attempt at deterrence, I would say. Now, there's also the story of Roosevelt's pop-up patrols, little ships. Well, this is simply defensive information patrol the week before Pearl Harbor. We would have been much better off if the admirals in Hawaii had done this too. That's what they needed to do. My principle, never let an oligarch attack you according to his timetable. Knock him off balance. Don't ever sit there and wait to be attacked, especially by one of these rigid oligarchical thinkers. Now, see this guy McCollum? This is Stinnett's great devil. Because he's the one who writes the 8 Provocations paper, what Stinnett calls the great 8 Provocations paper. So it means that McCollum ought to be in the conspiracy, right? He ought to be an active conspirator. Well, the problem with that is that on December 4th, 1941, McCollum is sitting in the Navy Department in Washington, and he gets the famous execute message, right? East wind rain. The Tokyo Weather Report. East wind rain means war with the United States, war with Britain. Japan will wage war on the U.S. So McCollum says, hey, wait a minute, let's send another warning to the fleet. Let's send them another warning. And Admiral Richmond K. Turner, that we're going to get to in a minute, says, no. So how can we blame Roosevelt for this? Let's blame this guy, Richmond K. Turner, and he is exactly the one that I do blame. Now, there are all kinds of these revisionist books. Have people read them? If you want to comment about any of these, the right-winger John T. Flynn, Morgenstern in the 40s. Charles Beard was a reputable historian. This is actually the biggest problem of all, is that somebody of this caliber, Columbia University, would go along with it. Backdoor to war, Roosevelt conspiring. Harry Elmer Barnes. Anybody know him? There's something today called the Barnes Review. It works for the American Free Press, has veered into anti-Semitism. Christopher Bolin and others. Theobald Bartlett is more balanced. Toland makes a big deal about the radio intercepts. He claims the Japanese were not doing radio science. Roberta Wohlstetter, this is a neocon. She's the wife of the top neocon, Wohlstetter, who died a little while ago. Gordon Pranger. All right. Now, Harry Elmer Barnes, out of all these guys, at the end of his lifetime, concedes there is simply no definitive documentary evidence which has been revealed and proves that Roosevelt was informed of an intent to strike at Pearl Harbor. I recommend this book, Costello. He's relatively good on Churchill and related issues. You can see he's got Churchill up there along with Roosevelt and MacArthur. The book that I recommend most of all that you read is, let me just see if I can get to it. There it is. This is the book. I recommend this book. Rusbridger and Nave. Betrayal at Pearl Harbor, How Churchill Lured Roosevelt into World War II. I think this does not have any of the apparatus that I've showed you so far. He doesn't understand the Washington Naval Treaty. He doesn't understand British geopolitics. He doesn't understand the battle between the battleship guys and the carrier guys, and so on down the line. But what he does understand is the codes. Because Eric Nave is someone who was a code breaker for the British Royal Navy and the Royal Australian Navy. And Rusbridger is a pretty good researchers. So if you're going to read one book, Rusbridger and Nave. Naturally, one of the things that Costello wants you to know about is that the whole business of December 7th, to focus everything on Hawaii and 5 obsolete World War I battleships, is itself a distortion. Because the military disaster in the Philippines is actually much more serious and comes 9 hours later. And here you have all your modern bombers in the Far East are destroyed on the ground. 9 hours after Pearl Harbor. That is to say, when the dawn reaches by midday in the Philippines. So we'll just bear that in mind. Now, this is just to remind you what a bad guy Churchill is. Gallipoli is the attempt to invade Turkey in World War I. It's an amphibious invasion. One of my relatives was blown up on the beach. He was a British soldier who stepped on a mine and nothing was ever found of him. So whenever I hear one of these damn neocons telling me what a genius Churchill is, I can hardly restrain myself from tearing him limb from limb. So he's an absolute military blunderer. He's one of the people who brings about the crash of 1929 by his gold policies, and he's, of course, a strikebreaker during the general strike in Britain in 1926. Now, you've got to imagine the scene. 18th of May, 1940. Winston Churchill and his alcoholic son, Randolph. He said, "Daddy! Daddy! The bloody frogs have given up! What do we do?" "That's all right, son. I shall drag the United States in." So his approach to the war is, once the French have been destroyed, he's going to drag the U.S. in. And remember, the U.S. has occupied Greenland, Iceland. The U.S. actually still occupies Iceland after all these years. You go to Iceland, it's basically a U.S. protectorate there. The U.S. is everywhere in Iceland. He's sending convoy escorts into the North Atlantic, and he's given a shoot-on-sight order. In other words, if you're a U.S. destroyer and you see a German or Italian naval vessel, sink it. Now, Churchill's view is different. The U.S. should enter the war against Germany and Japan with maximum losses to weaken both Japan and the U.S. in the post-war world, just the way they handled France, cutting it down as an ally during World War I. Is that principle basically clear? Because I think this is exactly, because the question is, why would Churchill do this? Why does he want to get U.S. ships destroyed and Pearl Harbor destroyed? Part of this. Now, Roosevelt's view is rather, Churchill and Stalin are both guilty of supporting Hitler in their own way. Stalin through the explicit Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So let them now fight Hitler for a while, and I'll give them Lend-Lease deliveries, and I'll get ready. But I'm not going to become the valet of Churchill and Stalin. Very interesting that Churchill's memoirs are blank from December 1st to December 7th, 1941. Whatever he was doing during those critical moments, and this is when the Japanese force is at sea, he doesn't want you to know it. In the memoirs, Churchill pretends that he got all of his Japanese intelligence from the U.S., and this is the critical code-breaking story, which we're going to get to now in a minute. In 1946, the Republicans, in an investigating committee, wanted Churchill to testify in the U.S. Congress about events leading up to Pearl Harbor. But majority vote, meaning the Democrats voted no. The request to subpoena or to invite Churchill was refused. This is a very interesting moment. This you could see in the minority Republican report. Now, there is a school of thought that says Churchill knew of the Japanese attack coming and warned FDR. This is actually my good friend